Thank you. Well, you've heard it all now, so good night. I shouldn't have had that second glass of wine, but anyway, it's amazing. It looks as though my 60-plus years is passing before me. I see so many of my friends and colleagues from the past, going way, way back. Anyway, it's amazing being back at D&AD. I recall that I had several pieces of work in the very first D&A show, which I think was 1962 or 63, at the London Hilton Hotel. And I thought I'd arrived. That was it. D&AD, I'd arrived. Later on, I believe I was on the D&AD Executive Committee in 68. I won several D&AD Silver Awards. When I won my first one, I showed it to my mother and said, "Look, I've won a Silver Award." She said, "It's wood." My mother was a very practical person who said her usual remark about me, because I had very limited formal education. She said, "He'll never be a professor." And I'm glad to see that one of my former governors from the University of Creative Arts is here this evening. And so I never became a professor, but I had a lot of professors under me. So there you are. Anyway, let's get going. Here we are. This was a D&AD jury, and you can see my hombres here. Harry Pescinotti was a wonderful art director of Nova, and sadly, David King, who passed away quite recently, was an incredible art director at the London Sunday Times. In fact, recently I was speaking to the man that mixed up the Academy Awards last year, Warren Beatty, and he said, that David actually supplied him. David was an expert on the Russian Revolution, and when he made Reds, he supplied him with so much information. Anyway, let's move on. I was actually born in a former Dickensian workhouse, St. George's Workhouse in Wapping. Dickens wrote frequently about it. And there am I suppose it was at the time of Shirley Temple. Proves that I did have hair at one time. My father was a waiter at the London Savoy Hotel, and one of the things, objects I still have today is his Savoy cocktail book, which of course is an Art Deco icon, and you could still see the impressions on the illustrations I used to trace from the book. Of course, today I have his autograph book, and he served all these great Hollywood stars. It's amazing, Edward G. Robinson, Marlene Dietrich. There's Disney and Chaplin, the year I was born. And of course, that was my first impression of Hollywood. I had this thing about Hollywood. Anyway, unfortunately, on the very first day of the London Blitz, on the 7th of September 1940, it sends shudders up my spine every time I hear that. My parents and I were in the house when it was a direct hit, and we were dug out of the rubble. This actual Heinkel 3 is exactly over our home, and it was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening when we were bombed. Anyway, I was evacuated to the countryside, to Thorpe, Egham, near Staines. And one of the things that I loved, my father would get magazines of Lilliput. And of course, I couldn't read or write. I was put in this school with much older children. And so the teacher would via me with cigarette cards and foreign postage stamps. So I grew up in this rather graphic, visual world rather than a literary world. But what I loved about Lilliput was they had these picture comparisons. And so I think throughout my career as a designer and a filmmaker, the idea of picture comparisons have stayed with me. My first venture into typography was on London railway stations. There was this machine that for 10p you can print out your name. There it is, sorry. You could print out your name. Most railway stations had these. And your name would come out on a strip of tin. The thing is that I always wanted to print out my name, but my name has 11 letters in it, and so I never got it. Anyway, after the war, my parents moved down to Margate. My parents had their honeymoon there earlier on, and for my 10th birthday, my father bought me this Ace projector, which I loved. I loved actually running the films backwards and seeing things going backwards. They finally bought this small hotel right on the seafront. One day, down on the beach in front of the hotel, they were actually shooting a movie. Here we go. Is it running? Yes, that's me. That's my big... Is it actually running? No, I can't see it here. That's my entry into the movies. Actually. So, anyway, following that, friends of my parents had a plastic factory. You know, they said there's a great future in plastics. Anyway, I did it for one day, and they said you had artistic aspirations. What it involved was actually spraying through a stencil flowers on the plastic cups. I did it for one day, that was enough. Other friends of my parents had the local Cameo Cinema, which in fact at one time was a silent movie house. And I didn't sit there for very long because I thought it was a way of seeing movies free of charge. But it was very hot and noisy, and I wasn't tall enough to see through the aperture. There am I. So I wasn't very successful as an assistant projectionist. Anyway, fortunately, at my parents' hotel, there was a distinguished designer as one of the guests. He's come down to see his parents. I attached myself to him, and he encouraged me to go to art school. Excuse me. There am I at our annual Christmas party. Here is an invitation I designed for the visiting lecturer Hans Schmoller, the Penguin typographer. Interesting enough, I'd forgotten about this invitation. Somebody reminded me about it, and I looked up Hans Schmoller on the internet, and that's what's so wonderful about it. And I found it, I think it was in the Bristol University archive, and Penguin gave me permission to use it. I graduated from Canterbury College of Art, and then I had to do my 2 years national service. There am I, out in Korea. I was there for 1 year, serving with the Royal Sussex Regiment. And one day my commanding officer said, "You're an artist, I've got an important task for you." He said, it's our duty, as we're the last British regiment. I in fact was the very last of 60,000 British troops to serve in Korea, but that's another story. I was the last one to step onto the landing craft as we went out to the troop ship. Anyway, he said, we're obliged to make this memorial to the glorious Gloucesters who suffered severely during the Korean War. This was 56, 57. And he said that there are 4 plaques that are supposed to be produced in Hong Kong will not be ready in time for the unveiling. Could you produce a trompe-l'oeil to look like the real thing? I had 9 days and nights, and there they are. You can't see them very well.
Craft to arrive. So we found within the regiment a certain Arnold Schwartzman, who was a graphic designer and a very good artist, who was going to paint. He was asked if he could do it in no time at all, and inside a week he had produced 4 plaques made to look like marble, on which he had inscribed the right inscriptions and the right emblems, and they were magnificent.
슈왈츠먼 씨의 활약 덕분에 제막식은 무사히 치러졌고 설말이 영국군 전적비는 그래픽 디자이너로서
a job at Southern Television as their sole graphic designer. It was a small TV station, and there was like one person for each department, so if somebody had the flu, there'd be no graphics. And I was so excited. My very first piece of artwork that went on the air was hand lettering of Manchester United, and I went down to the studio, and there it was, Manchester United. Anyway, here are a few of, I used to turn out 1 or 2 of these captions every day. They're promotion slides. Here's a number of other ones. And so Southern Television sent me up to Granada as a sort of training course for a while, and then I went back to Southern. And finally, I got a job at Associated Rediffusion in London, where I learned the rudiments of animation here in Maya under our Oxbury camera. Here's a still from one of my animated children's programs. In fact, they're all in color paper, but in those days it was just black and white television. It was quite primitive. In fact, back in Southern Television, the only means of lettering I had was letraset, not the letraset that you probably remember. It was the earlier version where you actually cut out each letter, put it onto a screen, and then turn it upside down, and then put it on the artwork. And what would happen on the roller captions, when it would go over the top, some of the letters would pop off. So I'd have to stand by in the studio and stick the letters back. Now, here is a series of Dickie Attenborough actually narrated Peter and the Wolf, and I illustrated it. About that time, Gebrauch Graphics, Novum Gebrauch Graphics, had produced a very nice article about the graphic designers at Rediffusion. Excuse me, I have a drop of water. And I received this very nice letter from Tom Wolsey. I know many of you, I'm sure, knew Tom Wolsey. He was a wonderful art director, a man about town. I first met him when he sent me this letter. He was working at Crawford's, and it was some years before he actually commissioned me, but then onwards I did a lot of work for him. This was, it's going on its own. There it is. This was one of several illustrations when he then went on to Queen magazine, and it was a special Christmas edition, and he asked me to illustrate the myth about the British Raj. Anyway, one day, one of my colleagues from the production department said to me, "Have you been down to Studio 5 today?" I said, no. He said, "Go and have a look." And of course, in those days, we weren't really officially allowed to do freelance work. Anyway, I went down there, and this illustration was used as a backdrop. It was about as tall as this room, with my name about that big at the bottom, and I was in fear that I'd get fired over it. Anyway, I didn't get fired, but what in fact happened, a couple of days later, I got a call from Jocelyn Stevens, who was the publisher of the magazine, and said, "Was that based on Camp Coffee label?" I said, "Yeah, of course it was." He said, "Oh, lawyer will be in touch with you. Anyway, I thought, God, I'm going to go bankrupt. Anyway, I got this call from the lawyer, and he said, was it really based on it? I said, yes. Anyway, in the end, they settled out of court, and it was okay. Now, I think they gave them free advertising. Here are some of the graphics that I did at Rediffusion for various plays, Darkness at Noon. And next, it's the only surviving piece of animation from one of my titles that I did for Rediffusion. Rediffusion had this award-winning house magazine, which I designed several of the covers and used to illustrate for it as well. There's another couple of the covers I did. And then here are a couple of freelance logos I designed. The one on the left of the swastika was this, the chairman of Associated Rediffusion actually owned land in Guernsey, and he actually owned the land where the Germans during the Second World War had an underground hospital. So this was the logo I designed for it. And on the right, it's for Muir and Norden, two well-known British comedy writers. Their names were creative partners. I also designed the logo for this week, which was this iris opening up. And I had this silly idea of having it made out of bronze. And of course, not only was it heavy, every week they'd have to put it back on the set, but the stage hands would curse me because it had these very sharp edges and they cut their hands on it. Anyway, one of the shows I worked on frequently was Ready, Steady, Go. This is the logo I designed for it. And it's interesting, today I was in contact on 3 occasions with a journalist who's actually writing a book on Ready, Steady, Go, which will involve a lot of my photographs. Here am I with Catherine McGowan, the queen of the mods. And every Friday evening I go down to the Studio 5 and photograph the various groups. And I took lots of pictures of the Beatles and Dusty Springfield, you name it, they're all there. On one occasion, Andrew Oldham and Mick Jagger turned up with this big shellac disc and said, would I listen to it? Because every 6 weeks I was changing the opening title sequence. And I said, it's fantastic, it's a bit long. I said, well, we're going to do a single of it. And they left me the actual disc. And of course, scratched in the middle of the shellac was Satisfaction. It was actually the original Satisfaction disc, which I gave to my younger sister. And to this day, she won't tell me what happened to it. I think she must have sold it for $5 or something. and then the Who, I actually did another, I'm sorry, I don't actually have the clip, only the frames from the sequence. But I shot this on the hill at Wembley Studios, the stadium, and I managed to recruit a number of students from the Royal College of Art with a new phase called skateboarding, believe it or not, and that was it. I don't think we saw skateboarding in England before that. Here's a tambourine that I painted for the Birds when they were on the show. And of course, for many years, I illustrated for the London Times newspaper and magazine. This is for New Society, Sunday Times, more Sunday Times. Anyway, after, I think it was 8 or 9 years of Associated Rediffusion, I set my eyes, I wanted to be in advertising. I mean, in New York, they were doing incredible ads and so on. And I thought I'd go and test the waters. And I went to New York and had a wonderful time. In fact, I was coerced into working for Lou Dorsman at CBS. He was the director of design there. I promised to go back, which I never did, but we became lifelong friends. But when I returned, I got this letter from a senior executive at Doyle Dane saying he liked my work and I was interested in working for them. But when I got back to London, I'd forgotten I'd actually answered an ad in the Times from Early Wazy Advertising. And when I went for the interview, they said, well, we really were looking for a copywriter. I said, well, I'm not a copywriter. But anyway, they gave me this wonderful position as the concept planning executive. It's a wonderful title. And I was like a deputy creative director. And I had a wonderful time there. It was incredible. Here's one of the ads I produced in my copy. Actually, I did like writing copy. And it was actually from a D&AD annual, this ad. And here's one of the graphics. It was a kit I designed for the TV Times when it went into color, and it won my first D&AD award. But one of my major accounts there was Coca-Cola, and here was a sequence. What I did, I made a rubber mold of a Coca-Cola bottle and watched it melt so it went into the glass. It was only an experimental one, it was never used. And then one day I was walking, as one does, through the rain in Piccadilly Circus, and I saw the reflections from the neon sign as it was then, and I thought this would make a great cinema commercial. And because of my relationship with The Who back in Ready, Steady, Go, I managed to persuade them to actually write and produce the soundtrack. There you are. And there's a very interesting story about that, but it's a rather long one. But basically what happened, the client, the Coca-Cola bottler from the UK, turned up with his two teenage daughters who were keen to meet the Who. And they said, we're going to be here for a while. I said, yes, we'll be here several hours. So they said, we're going off to dinner, we'll come back later. Anyway, by the time we finished the session and the mix was completed, the doorbell at the back of it was near midnight, at the back of the studio, Delane Lee on Kingsway, rang, and in came the client. And Keith Moon, who was a little bit crazy, gave me the master tapes and put me in a cupboard and closed the door. It was a very narrow cupboard. And the client said, oh, where's Arnold? I said, oh, you missed him. So he said, oh, do you think you could play it for me? And I said, no, it's all in the mix. And he said, oh, Arnold will play it for you when you see him next week. So they left. But then the Who went off to some club for a drink and left me locked in this cupboard. I then, for a very short period, I was persuaded by Terence Conran to be a director of Conran Design. It really didn't work out for me running a group of designers, and so I then went freelance, and I was one of the possibly worst commercial directors around. In fact, this is one I did. for warnings, advocates, that sort of custard drink, and for Jeremy Lloyd. Interesting enough, the client only wanted this little speedboat with one go on it, and my production designer was one of my colleagues from Really Fusion, Brian Morris, who then went on to be nominated for Alan Parker's film Evita. He sent me this picture recently and said, Arnold, it's a classic. It's the inspiration for Pirates 1. He was the art director of the Pirates of the Caribbean. All I did was just add some rigging. So, back to Tom Wolsey. Tom Wolsey kept me gainfully engaged as a stocking pack for him. And then the Sunday Times, Mark Boxer, and the wonderful Michael Rand, the art director, employed me to art direct some series. One on the history of invention, and the second one of the facts of life. In fact, one of my assistants, who became a very distinguished D&AD award winner, who's here this evening. Thank you. And then one of my colleagues from Waze's became involved in Warner Brothers Records, and so she was able to provide me with a lot of work. This was my second D&AD Silver Award, which was a kit to advertise Dandelion Records, everything you wish to know about Dandelion. Another project I was given was to work with the Rolling Stones. Here I employed David Montgomery to take the photographs. Andy Warhol sent me this one single prototype cover with the zip. In America we call it zipper. So I had to individually, they turned up late. I had organized all these setups all around London, and they arrived too late for the session. And Mick, he was the last one to arrive, by which time all the others had too much to drink. He said, what do you want me to do? So I said, well, so I think I suggested, do you want to take your clothes off? Or he did, I'm not certain. Anyway, they stripped down, and I had this idea of them holding the sleeve over their private parts. And it became quite a well-known campaign. And I also had produced a life-size cutout of Mick, which was on display in record stores, but you could see him in the front windows of a lot of people's homes around London.
Hello, this is Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. I'd just like to tell you that I can't think of anything to say really.
Yeah, Mick, I did a series of radio commercials with him, and it was unscripted, and I said, well, say something. He said, oh, it's all tinsel and glitter, it's all tinsel and glitter. Oh, I don't know what to say. But it was quite a successful series of ads. Another thing that Warner Brothers asked me to do was to design a record label with John Pasha's tongue logo. And I had this idea of doing a lenticular in several moves so that the tongue would go in and out. But unfortunately, lenticular being that sort of plastic material, when it's pressed onto a record, it just splits. So in the end, they were used as buttons and sold millions. I didn't get a penny. A self-portrait, must have been in the 70s, I suppose. This was for a double-page spread in a newspaper, which I didn't think they ever used it on well-known politicians. David Driver, I did a lot of illustrations for him for the Radio Times. To me, that was, when I was an art student, my ambition was to draw for the Radio Times. I had all these famous people like Eric Fraser and so on that drew for them. Sadly, David couldn't come today. I got an email this morning. He fell over and had a little accident yesterday, so he couldn't come. But I did a lot of work for him, and this is the moon landing. And what was interesting that I became a good friend of Chuck, the second man to land on the moon. This is another illustration of the Kennedy assassination for the Sunday Times magazine. I was very late in delivering my illustrations in those days, and Michael Ram wanted this the next morning, and he kept me overnight to finish it. Was my early business card when I thought of Superman. This is based on the early Coca-Cola label. This is me today. It's interesting. Is the image missing? Oh, here it is. Sorry, I'll go forward to it. Yes, Alan Parker has to have his little joke. Yeah, well. Going back, this is. I then joined a group called the Designers Film Unit, making commercials, and the letterhead, the design, the card was based on an old cigarette card, and I had 4 slots in the letterhead, and so the business card will be slotted into the letterhead. There's Alan again. And then, through the connection with a producer at Really Fusion, who then became the head of London Weekend Television, she owned a celebrity a dining club in Mayfair, and she asked me, or her husband asked me, if I would be the editor and designer of their magazine, and I produced a number of issues of it successfully, and with a wonderful assistant, Celia Stoddart. What was interesting, Groucho Marx, I actually worked with Groucho when he was doing his show at Really Fusion, and I'd have these meetings with him, and we'd meet for about 5 minutes. He says, I have responsibilities, I have a raincoat and umbrella outside, goodbye, and he'd walk out, and he'd do this every time we had a meeting. Through that connection with that club, I met several celebrities, one of them being Len Dayton, who became a lifelong friend, and we actually co-authored a book on airships with him. Then my friend Stella Richmond from the White Elephant Club had this idea of a charity cookbook for underprivileged children, and I invited lots of my designer, photographers, artist friends to contribute, and they all did. One person that I really wanted to contribute to it was Saul Bass in Hollywood, my big hero, and I wrote to him, but I didn't hear back. But about 6 months later, just before I was about to go to press, I get this phone call saying, I'm in London, I'm sorry, my mail has just been, I'm making a film here, my mail has just arrived. If it's not too late, I would be happy to produce a page for you. And I said, well, I kept back one recipe for you, sea bass. And so we met for dinner that evening. We went out. Donald Silverstein allowed us to use his studio. We jointly took the photograph, and it was in the book. Unfortunately, when the book came out, I never saw proof. They actually flopped his design. Anyway, but I don't remember how much time passed by. The next thing, I get an invitation from him to join him in Hollywood. And this is an article in Campaign saying, possible genius at large. And Saul said, it's a marriage made in heaven. I'm a genius, but you're not a genius yet. You will be one day. Unfortunately, Barry Day sent him a copy of it. Next thing, I get this very angry Saul on the phone. He said, did I say that? I said, well, you did. He said, oh, but I thought, you know, here am I committed myself to joining him back 6,000 miles away, and I've already upset the man. But anyway, and here's Saul and myself. He was a wonderful person. This was at the opening, actually, of an exhibition I curated on the posters of Abram Games. And but I only stayed with Saul for 6 months. Here's the one poster I designed for the Girl Scouts of America while I was with him. And I didn't like the idea, once again, of running a studio, not doing much of my own design. So I said, I don't think it's working out, and he understood, and he felt rather bad about it. I said, I won't leave, I'll stay on a couple of months and work out whether to go back to London or see if I can find some employment here. Anyway, one evening, he and his wife, Elaine, invited my wife and his older out for dinner. And over dinner said, you know, I was asked to make this 12-minute short documentary for a new museum. But I thought we'd make it together, but as you're leaving, I turned it down this morning. I said, oh, I'm sorry. I said, okay. About 10 minutes later, I said, well, if you haven't got anything lined up, why don't you take it on? Okay, next day I received a phone call from the head of this new organization. He said, oh, Mr. Bass tells us you're a genius. I said, oh, here we go again. He loves the word genius. So I said, it's very nice of him. I think he felt guilty that he turned the job down. Anyway, I met with them, took it on, and in fact, because it was for a museum, I actually produced it in 21 projectors. There was one live-action 35mm Panavision projector, two 60mm archival footage, and 18 slide projectors. It took me 2.5 years to put it together, but I was most fortunate that I was able, where is she? There we are, to recruit Elizabeth Taylor and Orson Welles to narrate it. But there am I, having very little experience as a director, directing Orson Welles. Imagine what that was like. Elizabeth's wonderful. We actually recorded Elizabeth's narration in London because she was under contract to make The Mirror Cracked here. And the film was come together, took 2.5 years, and here's my opening title sequence. imagine a lot of studio heads, personalities, movie stars, to see it. And I remember Barry Manilow saying to me, if you only had it on one piece of film, you could enter it for the Academy Awards. And I said, well, it's had such good notices. We were thinking of doing an optical transfer to one piece of film, which we did. The optical transfer was completed 1 week before entries for the Academy Awards. It was then nominated, and finally it won. I managed to persuade Elizabeth Taylor and Orson Welles to narrate it. Shortly afterwards, it won the Academy Award.
And the winner?
Yes?
The envelope was open, and they read out my name.
The winner is Genocide, Arnold Schwartzman and Rabbi Marvin Heyer.
Up I jumped. I remember that night quite vividly. It was 1982. I really hadn't prepared the speech because I was convinced that one of the other nominees was going to win. I was absolutely convinced.
I'd like to thank the members of the Academy.
What was really incredible about it was the fact that dreaming way back of Hollywood and all the movie stars. There am I giving this speech, and down in the front rows there, looking up at me were people like Bob Hope and Barbara Stanwyck and all these Hollywood legends, Danny Kaye and so on, and it was quite incredible. They brought all the winners back up, and I think we were all swaying, singing, "There's no business like show business," I think it was. And standing right next to me was Liberace. My whole life has been a dream. What can one say? It is the pinnacle, I suppose, of achievement in the film business. I'm going to thank my wife, Isolde. For the last 40 years, Isolde has done all my production work and research. And without her, it wouldn't happen. Anyway, that was 1982. That same year, I received a phone call. I was working on a project for the European Broadcast Union in Europe. And I received a phone call from the 1984 Olympic Committee and saying, was I interested in making a documentary, because I won the Oscar that year, on the history of Olympic Games. I said, I'd love to. And I said, I'll be back in 3 weeks' time. Anyway, I met with the head and the various people at the Olympic Committee. Finally, they actually gave the job to the TV network in exchange for some South American rights, but then learnt about my design background, and they gave me the job as director of design. Here am I with the LA president. He was an incredible businessman, Peter Uberoff, that managed to get all these sponsors in for the Games. Here am I presenting him with one of the logos designed for the Olympic Arts Festival, which is this. And of course, the color palette was designed by Deborah Sussman of Sussman Fraser. They were responsible for most of the environmental graphics, and I think that the credit's due to them for the major part of it. This is a logo I designed for the Olympic Spirit team, and as it was the 23rd Olympiad, I made the pictograms in Roman numerals XX111. Here am I with some of the uniforms. We commissioned Levi's in San Francisco to design uniforms, and again in Deborah's palette. For the official invitation, one copy went to each nation, and it was inside, signed by all the committee and so on. And I had this idea, if you put the Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius, swifter, higher, stronger, together in that, with a vellum overlay, I picked out USA. I commissioned 6 official posters, and nobody wanted cycling, so I took cycling, and I had the idea of creating the Olympic rings out of cycle wheels. I managed to contact 3 Olympian cyclists, and they said, well, I showed them a sketch. I said, they're not going to be easy to do. I said, well, you just keep going around. And in those days, I was using film, and I remember I got through 10 rolls of film, so that's 360 frames that I shot. And I could only do it, I was in the middle of the velodrome, and I wanted a higher wall. And I almost got it. There you are. There was no Photoshop in those days. When it came during the games, the International Olympic Committee have their session, and it was the 88th session, so it was easy peasy. I took the rings and made the 88 out of it. And also it was the first year they had rhythmic gymnastics, and so I had the 88 made out of ribbons for the poster. Here's the Olympic torch. I commissioned a product designer to design the torch, but I designed all the decoration around the top. I quite honestly thought this one looked like a lavatory plunger. I actually commissioned Richard Donges, a local product designer, and he came up with 11 really beautiful designs, but P.D. Ruproff went for this one. So he was the boss. Then I was very much involved with the American Academy. This is a logo I designed for their documentary conference, which I renamed .con. A production company called Limelight. There's another play on images. When the British Academy, on the Cubby Broccoli, the producer of the James Bond films, I had this idea of having a stalk of broccoli on the plate with the 007 logo. Somebody called the BAFTA office and said, what's the significance of the and then they realized, and said, thank you, goodbye. Here's a couple of panels I designed for a committee that my wife and I on called Brit Week, and this was a sort of history of Brits in Los Angeles. Again for BAFTA, when we honored John Travolta, I thought his signature V would make up the word Travolta. When Dustin Hoffman, after Tootsie, the image of him against the Star Spangled Banner, you opened it up and it became the Union Jack. I then, in 2000, I think it was, I was elected the chairman of BAFTA Los Angeles. And here am I with Dustin, the recipient that year, as Travolta, and Tony Bennett, and Billy Connolly. So I said to my board, you know, we give out this lump of glass as an award every year. Why don't you have a custom-made one? They said, well, you're a designer. Why don't you design it? So here's one of the other imitations I designed for BAFTA, and based on the silhouette of Britannia. So I came up with this idea of having the next award, which we were giving to Steven Spielberg. And it's, again, a trompe-l'oeil. Unfortunately, the film around it, you lose, but it's the actual helmet and face of Britannia. Anyway, it's made out of light alloy. Anyway, on the very evening it was presented,
the chairman of BAFTA LA, Mr. Arnold Schwartzman, and Mrs. Isolde Schwartzman. His Royal Highness, the Duke of York. Accompanied by his wife, the lovely Kate Capshaw. Tonight's honoree, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steven Spielberg.
this wonderful object is here. In case anybody is unaware, this award is unique. It is quite literally the heaviest award anybody has ever asked a member of the royal family to pick up. Most awards are small things and are light as a feather. A few chickens would go into this, I can tell you. This particular award weighs something in the region of 28 pounds. It's very small and perfectly formed. All good things, I'm told, come in small packages. Stephen is not going to forget this, ever. Because if he does, he'll drop it on his toe. And he will remember, when he looks down at his blackened toenail, the Duke of York dropped that on my foot.
Interesting enough, our Consul General and his wife was in there, in the audience this evening. So you see, yeah, the problem was that I thought that titanium, a good friend of mine produced the titanium for the space shuttle, a Brit, and he actually donated this enormous block of titanium. And I thought of spectacle frames and bicycles are made out of titanium. It was very light, but as a solid block, it was extremely heavy. And I didn't realize it until I went to pick it up from the people that made it. Okay. My next documentary for the same organization, the Simon Regional Center, was called Echoes That Remain. And here am I in Krakow, in Poland. There's an incredible wall made out of old Jewish gravestones, and I actually tracked all the way along it. The next film, another documentary for them called Liberation, which was about D-Day and the liberation of Europe. I remember as a child on the BBC having those timpanis, ... the Morse code for victory. And I actually, Carl Davis, who wrote the score, actually would employ the very man to do the timpanis for it. If you don't mind, I'll skip and move on because I can see I'm going to run out of time. And here there was a companion book to the film, and the end papers, again, that was that picture comparison idea. There are the troops exercising on one side, and sadly the remnants of the war on the other. I think I'm on my 17th or 19th book. This, again, while I was on location making these Jewish-related films, I produced a book called Graven Images, of images on Jewish gravestones. Another book, which was on Los Angeles Art Deco. A book which mainly was about my large collection of gramophone needle tins. The University of California, Southern California, had this master design series. Paul Rand, Milton Glaze, a lot of well-known designers were invited to design the quarterly cover. This was my first one, and they invited me again. And this is one of my favorite designs, I think, because I like the idea of Pinocchio's nose being the extension. But they turned it down. They said, oh, it's a Disney copyright. It wasn't afterwards. I plucked up courage to tell them, you know, Disney do not own the copyright to Pinocchio. It's a 19th century story. But anyway, it was too late. But anyway, the next day, I had to come up with something very quick. and a play on words. I had extension. The 10 was 10 over 10, and by coincidence, their new headquarters was number 10 in Westwood. Here is a poster I designed. Again, a number of artists were invited to design a series of posters on sequences, and I chose Shakespeare's quotation. I was invited to give a talk about Saul Bass after he passed away in Austin, Texas. I used the images from his Anatomy of a Murder to make the frame. I was recruited by Sam Wanamaker to be on the Western board of the Shakespeare Globe, and I produced these fundraising bottles of wine to raise funds, and you turn the bottle, it's always to be or not to be, whichever way. It's another Shakespeare-related poster. One of our senators was up for re-election, and her name was Boxer. So I thought it would be great to use, base it on a typical boxing poster, and the fact that she has an X in the middle of her name for voting, which was perfect. For a museum in Los Angeles, the Scoble Museum, I produced these timeline panels, and also a permanent 8-screen room that continuously runs these films. Another one of my books was on decorative signage that I photographed around the world. London Art Deco, which is now in its 4th and coming up for its 5th edition. I just love Art Deco. And next, one of my closest friends is the late Alan Fletcher. He was such a close friend and was always feeding me jobs, not jobs that he didn't want. He was just so generous. And one of the things, one day he called me up and said, "Oh, in your book on signage, do you have any images I can use?" I said, "Yeah, be my guest." He said it was for a calendar. So I said, "Well, I have an idea. How do you like this?" And so I had 384 days of the year, 365 days of the year. And he said, "You got the job." And so I produced this calendar of all these photographs that I had taken. Palm Springs Film Festival invited me to produce their poster for their annual festival. Unfortunately, when I got there, they said it has to go to press tonight. I said, "You never told me that." So we went to the local archive. I got a lot of images there. They put me in a room. I did this paste up, and by 6 o'clock, they drove me to the printer, and the poster was done. When Saul Bass died, Saul had actually produced 5 of the official Academy posters. And the president of the Academy called me and said, "Well, you seem the logical contender. Would you be interested in taking it over?" I said, "I'd love to." So my first concept was having all the previous 69, was it, best films making up an Oscar. And it drove my wife Isolde crazy, actually putting it in. The wonderful quote that the executive director of the Academy said, thank heavens for Gigi, otherwise it would never have worked, because you needed that short one for the neck. I then was commissioned to produce their programs every year and the cinema trailers and so on. And this is coming next, it's the next trailer. those together very quickly because there was a short time span between the nominations and when they had to be put out into the cinemas. And so I have to actually guess 12 best actors, best actresses, best films. And then when the nominations 5 o'clock in the morning were announced, I disregard all the ones that didn't get nominated. And by 1 o'clock, I think it was, I'd go into the Academy, screen it, get the approval from the Academy, and then run with it. And in fact, I think that first one, or maybe a couple, we actually produced at Quantel here in the UK. So I'd fly over all the elements, do it here, and then go back again. During that period, as it happens, while I was at Quantel, I see we're almost into an hour, so I'll be quick. Peter Mandelson called me and said, would I take over from Stephen Bailey as running the Dome? Anyway, it's a long story and it never happened, thank goodness. So here is my next poster, which is a cinema marquee for the 17th Annual Academy Awards, and managed because of the Academy's influence, got George Lucas to allow me to use one of his motion control cameras to shoot it. Behind me, they were shooting on the other motion control camera, Star Wars. Forgive me, I'll move forward because getting him, you're all want to get home to bed, and you haven't seen the good stuff yet. So anyway, the next year, the Academy decided to move from Monday to Sunday. And being born in the sound of Bow Bells, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I told Gary Oldham, I said, I think I was born closer to the Bow Bells than you. He said, your wife has already told me that. So anyway, he won, that was great. Being familiar with bells being rung on Sunday in the UK, I didn't hear it much in Hollywood these days. I came up with this idea of having bells with a clapper in it. They loved the idea, but they said they were concerned that it had religious connotations. So I thought very quickly, I said, oh, no, it's the Liberty Bell. And I won. So I got away with it. The next year was 2000, and it suddenly reminded me of Robot Marie from Metropolis. And so that was my inspiration for that. And so on the billboard on Sunset Boulevard, I had the neon going up and down. Here's the street banners. Here's some of the many pieces I designed for the Academy Awards. One day I went in to see the production designer, and I liked the model of his set, and I said, oh, that'd make a wonderful pop-up. And so I produced that as inside one of the programs. Again, one of the pieces I showed to the president of the Academy was a pop-up book I designed for the Museum of Moving Image in London, and they ran out of money and finally closed down, and so the book never happened. And I showed it to the Academy president. They said, oh, let's produce it as a gift at the Governor's Ball. So that was given out as a governor's ball following the Academy Awards. I think it was 2001. I give lectures around the world. This one was in Mexico, in Querétaro, in China, Beijing, and in Shanghai. Here are some of my wonderful students in the university, Tsinghua University in Beijing. They were incredible. I would set them a project in the morning, and the next day they'd come up with finished artwork. Incredible. Here's a talk I gave in Shanghai. My wife and I are actually working as the creative director on the 4th poster series for an organization called Visions and Values. It's a Jewish organization, so I made the Star of David, and two of the contributors was Milton Glaser and Seymour Quast, so I used a couple of their images. Here's one of my posters for the series.
또 다큐멘터리 감독으로 왕성한 활동을 하고 있는 슈왈츠먼 씨. 그의 창작 욕구는 오늘도 쉬지 않는다.
I designed two murals for Cunard's Queen Elizabeth ship. This is one on London's Art Deco clocks. They're on the grand lobby of the Queen Elizabeth. And the other one is on the other side of the lobby. And that is on the spirit of transportation. Anyway, then my lifelong friend, Len Dayton, asked me and HarperCollins if I would design the reissue of 29 of his book jackets. And here's a few of them.
阿诺的老朋友作家 Dayton 认为，能从他的作品中看到深意。
Some designers design patterns and shapes and colours. Well, Arnold does that, but he also has an intellectual reason behind all of the design work that he does. And that's what makes it so rewarding to look at it, to interpret it, and see what he is saying to you through the design.
He's a very private person, very rarely gives interviews. I don't know if you saw his series SSG on TV recently. I had this crazy idea for my collection of ephemera of making Bernard Sampson's name out of my old airline tickets at the bottom. Of course, it's a great idea, but if you go into a bookshop, they'll never display them in that order. So, one of our annual Christmas cards. 1974, I was elected a member of the Lyon Scholastic International, and every year we are asked to design some indigenous object. This year was in Amalfi, and so I came up with a Four Seasons pizza, which an Italian printer liked it so much they had it on their calendar. When it was in London, it was a teacup, so it was tea for two and four for tea. 2 for tea and 2 for tea, whatever. My hometown of Margate after the war, the hotel I always stay at, where my father, when we first moved there, was the manager, was the Walpole Way Hotel. And the owner has this gallery now of napkins. I've now, and that's how I pay when I stay there, I give her a napkin. This is, I just designed the 7th one for her. This is one of them. Here's a recent poster I did, tribute to Shakespeare, another part of Brit Week. Steve Heller, who just wrote the foreword to my monograph, which comes out shortly, had this thing called Complaints in Libel Right, and I thought, who's complaining? I'm just having a grouse. So, and then Michael Wolff and Alan Dye had this idea of asking designers to redesign the elderly crossing. So this is my rough design. I thought of having a zebra crossing. Our last book, which just came out last year, was on Los Angeles Central Library. Book that's just gone to press is Art Deco City, my photographs of Art Deco around the world. And in 2013, and yet on my fourth visit back to Korea, during the making of the documentary, I was asked if I had to design another United Nations memorial, what would you do? So for the camera, I made some sketches, and to my surprise, a group of people turned up afterwards and said, we'd like to build it. Anyway, here's the Korean.
사단법인 우리민족교류협회는 오늘 서울 용산전쟁기념관에서 정전 60주년을 기념한 한국평화의 종 기념비 건립식을 가졌습니다. 높이 6m의 한국평화의 종은 UN이라는 문자를
It's basically the idea of the reunification of North and South, and I thought of having a UN link. There's Isolde and I on our last visit to Korea with it. What is amazing though, this was 2013, they built it. They're now building one on a hilltop overlooking North Korea. It's going to be just a couple of feet short of Nelson's Column. It's going to be enormous. And it's supposed to be unveiled this coming November. With the current problems, I don't know if it will happen. In fact, I yesterday sent an email to 2 Korean journalists asking for more news. Anyway, my most recent project is, being a Marketonian, right next to the promenade shelter where T.S. Eliot, when he had a nervous breakdown, was said to have written The Wasteland about Margate, on Margate Sands. I can connect nothing with nothing. And I found out that the anagram of T.S. Eliot is toilets. And right next door, the promenade shelter, is a public toilet. So this is a mural design that would go on there. And I'm thinking of producing a laser stencil to do it. So from way back, stenciling flowers on plastic cups, I'm now graduated to toilets. Anyway, thank you for your patience. This is the merchandising. My monograph comes out in July. Thank you.